Well, 2 weeks ago, Laura and I were at Hume Lake for the Pastors' Conference. Up there? Yeah, there we are. And it was beautiful. In fact, here, let me block my face out and show you the mountain there. Now it's even more beautiful. It was wonderful. It was we had a wonderful time. It was great. And, you know, I'm from the Midwest, and for me, the drive alone to get there is worth the trip for me. You know, I'm used to flatness, just utter flatness as far as the eye can see. And no mountains to speak of. Yes, we have, you know, forests and things like that, and we have rain, but we don't have any kind of mountains. And it's wonderful. But ultimately, we go on these kinds of retreats to get away from the busyness of our responsibilities and to be alone with God, ultimately. And at our best, we go to the mountains to have a mountaintop experience with God. We love that. That's what we really want. We want mountaintop experiences with God. We want that when we come here on Sunday. To be honest, we want it when we read our Bibles. We kind of expect something like that to happen. We want it when we pray to ourselves or with others, when we come together to pray. We want mountaintop experiences with God. And if the Lord won't take us to be with Him right now, well then, by golly, I want some little glimmers of what we're going to see in heaven, don't I? I want those experiences that I know I'm going to have forever, but I want them now. I think all of us want that. I want a little piece of heaven now. But the problem is it doesn't always happen. Laura and I had a great time at Hume Lake, and it was wonderful. We had wonderful rest, but we really didn't have any kind of mountaintop experience with God that week. I mean, maybe Pastor Tom did, but we didn't. That's okay. It was a good time. It was a restful time. We had good times in talking and in worship, but it wasn't one of those mountaintop experiences that you remember the rest of your life. And really, when we come to church, we realize that more often than not, we don't have those kinds of experiences when we come to church. Or when we read our Bibles, or when we pray. More often than not, we don't really have mountaintop experiences every time. And I think it's pretty obvious, because I think if we had those mountaintop experiences every Sunday in church, we might be a little more crazy than we normally are. If we had those mountaintop experiences whenever we read our Bibles, I don't think we could get out of our rooms. If we had those mountaintop experiences when we prayed together, I think we might just become Pentecostal. I don't know. But we don't. And you know what? It's normal. It usually doesn't mean there's anything wrong with our walk. It isn't something that God has promised will always happen when we get away to a mountain, when we go to church, when we pray, or when we read our Bibles. But still, we don't like that, do we? We still long and look for the mountaintop with God. And there's nothing wrong with that either. But why is it that the mountaintop with God doesn't happen often and doesn't last long when it does happen? Well, I think today we're going to try and answer this question as we continue our series on who is Jesus in Matthew 17, where we see the greatest mountaintop experience. Now, we have preached on this before, or I have, Easter, I think a year ago, a little bit, but so you might notice some similarities here, but we can't escape this chapter, so we're going to dive right in. But we're going to look at some new things in there as well. And I think as we look at Matthew 17, we're going to see the glory of Jesus in this mountaintop experience, but we're also going to see the humility of Jesus, and we're going to end by looking at the disciples' response and what it tells us perhaps about what our response should be. So let's first take a look at the glory of Jesus. That's your first fill in the blank there, the glory of Jesus. We're going to look at that in verses 1 through 5 of Matthew 17, and I will have this all on the screen as well, so you can read up there or look in your copy of the Scriptures. Matthew 17, verse 1 through 5 says this. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Can you imagine this event? If you got to be one of these 3 disciples, just 3 of them got to see this happen. What an experience this must have been to see Jesus in all his glory. What a mountaintop experience it must have been. But why did they get to have this experience, and why did Jesus do this at all? You might remember Jesus, through the first 16 chapters of Matthew, he hasn't done anything quite like this yet. And people have been asking him for signs and wonders to prove himself, and certainly you would think if it was any one of us, I would probably do this transfiguration all over the place. In the synagogue, out in the crowds. But he takes just 3 disciples up on a mountain where no one will see it. Why? Well, there is a very specific reason why this happened, and a comparison happening that is obvious to any Jewish person familiar with their Old Testament. And it began with the very first phrase of verse 1. And it shows us that Jesus is compared here with Moses at Mount Sinai. Jesus compared with Moses at Mount Sinai. Let's look back at verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There are 2 significant phrases in this short verse that are there for the express purpose of comparing Jesus with Moses. No other reason than that. And the 2 phrases are, after 6 days, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. After 6 days, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. Now, before we move on with this, it may seem to you like these phrases are just minor details, but these 2 things that you also, well, there's 2 things you also need to know, about the Gospel of Matthew and all the Gospels for that matter. And that is, first, that they're not detailed biographies of Jesus' life. I think we've talked about this before, but it bears restating, especially here. They hardly ever tell us the day of the week, the time of the year, that Jesus did this or that miracle. Luke is a bit of an exception because he's a doctor and likes details. But for the most part, they don't tell us these kinds of details. The gospel writers are not so much concerned with simply telling us the facts, the dates, the times, and the chronological details. We have to know that about the Gospels. They write differently than we would. If we were writing the Gospel accounts, we would know the time, we would know the place, we would have everything in order, but it's just a different style of writing. And for example, only one of the Gospels, Luke, tells us that Jesus was 30 years old when he began his ministry. If he didn't tell us that, we wouldn't know. We would have to just guess. None of the others really give us any details about his age, and so when any of the Gospels do give us details like this, especially those outside of Luke, we know it is for a significant reason. It's not simply connecting one story to the next. There's a reason why details are added. Second thing we have to know is that Matthew quotes and alludes to the Old Testament in his gospel more than any other gospel account by a long shot. And the rest of the Gospels and the whole New Testament do this very often. The New Testament is so grounded on the Old Testament that we can hardly understand any of it unless we first know the Old Testament very well. In fact, the writers of the Gospels and most of the epistles assume that their audience knows their Old Testament. And for most of them, the Old Testament was all they had. It was their complete Bible. It was their Sunday or Saturday or Friday night movie. It's the Bible. For the most part, that's all they had. And so we have to understand the Old Testament is the foundation for everything we see in the New Testament. And so many times the Old Testament is quoted or referenced or hinted at in ways that we just pass right over. We don't even think about. And this is one of those times. So I hope to kind of help you reveal this underlying foundation. This part we've talked about before, but it bears repeating. That will help you to understand this passage as I think it was meant to be understood. So why does Matthew say, after 6 days, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves? Why does he say these two phrases? There they are right there for you. Well, the combination of these two phrases would immediately spark one very important comparison in the minds of a first century Jewish reader, and that is Moses at Mount Sinai. Moses at Mount Sinai. Let's look at Exodus 24, verses 12 to 17, and see if we find any similarities. This is what it says there. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commands I have written for their instruction." Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Notice any similarities? Well, let's point out a few. First of all, Jesus and the disciples in Matthew 17, you'll see, will be mirroring Moses and the Israelites here in Exodus 24. The first thing we see in both these passages is that Moses and the disciples went up on a mountain by themselves. Exodus 24, Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. We know later that Moses went to the highest part of the mountain to be with God by himself. Joseph was there with him, but it was a little farther down. Matthew 17, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. He's specifically pointing that out, by themselves. Second thing we see in both these passages is that a cloud overshadowed them, Moses and the disciples. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it. Matthew 17, when he was still speaking, Peter, a bright cloud enveloped them, covered them. Third thing we notice is that these both happened after a 6-day period God spoke. In Exodus 24, for 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. Matthew 17, after 6 days, and we get down to verse 5, a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Which is after 6 days, by the way. Why would you say that anyway? Why would you just throw out after 6 days? Doesn't really make any sense, does it? Unless it's talking about something else very specifically, and I think it's talking about this here. And finally, the last comparison we see here is that God's glory was revealed on the mountain with God. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. Matthew 17, there he, Jesus, was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as a light. So you see in all these comparisons that Jesus is doing something very specific. And he wants his disciples to know what he's doing and why he's doing it. God himself is saying something very specific. And this is, of course, not to mention the fact that Moses, in verse 3, is there, right? Just to really point it out and make sure we're getting the point. Moses is there. Why is Moses there? Well, it might have to do with this comparison Jesus is trying to make. But there's another detail that could have led us to believe something special was happening here, and that is your next fill in the blank, mountains in the Bible. Mountains in the Bible. Mountaintops, just like us, were significant in Old Testament times as a place where gods are worshipped and met. We have Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, right, in Jerusalem. The Israelites were repeatedly condemned for their worship of pagan gods on the hilltops and mountaintops. Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse at the Mount of Olives. He often goes alone to a mountain to pray. Whenever we see people going on a mountain, then, in the Bible, we should be thinking in terms of meeting God. And the same is true, really, of us today. We go to mountains because we want to get away, and we hope to kind of meet God there, to be alone with God, to be in God's presence. This doesn't mean that mountains have some kind of special power or something. We should all move up to Hume Lake or something like that. But it means that in the Bible, the culture of the time and the way that God used mountains was as a place to meet God. And you should also know that the mountain they're on here we think is Mount Hermon, which is another place we go to get away and be with God, right? So when we see Jesus going up on a mountain after 6 days with a select few disciples, sirens should be going off in our mind that something very significant is about to happen, and that Jesus is I can't think. He's what's the word? I want to say mimicking. That's not a word. Mimicking. Oh my goodness. He's mimicking Moses. We should see this right away. So we have a comparison of two mountaintop experiences, really. Mount Sinai and now Mount Hermon. But why Moses? You have to answer this question. What's so important about Moses? Why would Jesus go to this much effort to mimic what Moses has done? Well, Jesus is compared with Moses, is your next fill in the blank, because the Messiah would be greater than Moses. Jesus is compared with Moses because the Messiah would be greater than Moses. You see, it was a very big deal to compare anyone with Moses. Moses was considered the greatest prophet who had ever lived. The book of Deuteronomy ends with these statements about Moses in chapter 34. Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. This is quite a statement. The statement stood true through the entire history of Israel. No prophet had ever been used of God to do great signs and wonders like Moses did, to the same level Moses did. The plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the water from a rock, the manna from heaven, the giving of the law, the establishing of a nation. No one had ever done anything anywhere close to this in the Old Testament. And most significantly, no one had seen God and been with God face to face, that close. Nobody. So Moses was so close to God that his face, we know, actually glowed after meeting with him. Nobody did that either. We see this in Exodus 34, don't we? When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. He turned into a glowworm. Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. It's very interesting. And nobody else had glory beaming from their face in the Old Testament. And then Jesus has glory beaming from his face, doesn't he? We'll get to that in a second. So Moses, we understand, had a closer relationship with God and did greater works than any other prophet, any other priest, any other king, anyone. And so now the whole Old Testament is set up. The Messiah is set up so that Israel would know who to compare him to, compared to Moses. All throughout the Old Testament history and the New Testament history until Jesus, Israel's waiting, anticipating, looking for somebody greater than Moses. And we've talked about this before, but that's also why the Pharisees, the religious leaders, thought so highly of Moses. Because the Old Testament thought so highly of Moses. And because they knew the Messiah would have to be someone better than him. And that's why Moses is talked about so much in the Gospels. So someone would have to come who would be greater than Moses. Someone who would also do what Moses was not able to do. Someone who would put an end to the curse of sin and crush the serpent's head, which Moses did not do. Someone who would fulfill the promise to Abraham to bless the whole world. Someone who would bring God back into complete fellowship with his people. The Messiah was coming, but no one knew when. So let's turn back to chapter 17, verse 2. After reading verse 1, we anticipate that Jesus and the disciples were going to be drawn up into the presence of God in a cloud, as Moses was. But in verse 2, there comes a twist to history, and we find out that the disciples were in for a little bit of a surprise, for Jesus shows himself now to be greater than Moses in a way that no one ever expected of the Messiah. Then he, Jesus, was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Well, what does this mean? I think this means that Jesus is God. Jesus is God. A few things to notice here. Notice first that Jesus shines with God's glory. Jesus shines with God's glory. You see, Jesus' face shines with a glory that is his own. Jesus has a glory emanating from within himself. He doesn't reflect it like Moses did. And his light is something that the disciples couldn't even look at. Just as the sun shines with a light coming from within itself, Jesus shines with the glory of God coming from within himself. See, Moses shone like a mirror reflecting God's glory. Jesus shines with his own, showing he is God. When the disciples went up on the mountain and were comparing this experience with the Sinai experience, Moses is not being equated with Jesus. Moses is being equated now really with the disciples, because Moses went up to see God, and the disciples did just that as well. They saw God, Jesus himself. The second thing we see is that Jesus is greater than Moses and Elijah. As if Jesus being transfigured before them was not enough, Moses and Elijah show up talking with Jesus. They don't have glory emanating from themselves. They, in fact, are there to see Jesus too. But why Elijah? What's so special about Elijah? Well, the third point is that Elijah's presence proves that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. Elijah's presence proves, it's kind of the last proof, that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. Let's look at Malachi 3:1 and 4:5-6, which says this: "See, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty." Chapter 4, "See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse." And we know from earlier in Matthew and in the other Gospels as well that John the Baptist was the one who did just that. He proclaimed a message of repentance for the kingdom of heaven and the Messiah were at hand. And now, as kind of a sealing that, because people weren't quite sure, is Jesus Elijah? Is John the Baptist Elijah? Well, now we have Elijah here standing before Jesus, kind of confirming that Elijah, yes, he has come. His work is done, and now the Messiah is here. But that's still not all. Fourth thing we see here is that Jesus is the Son of God, all must obey. Jesus is the Son of God, all must obey. We see this in verse 5. I'm looking back at verse 5. "While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him.'" Jesus is the Son of God. But not the Son of God just as David was the Son of God, a chosen individual to have God's blessings, but this is the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. He has divinity flowing from within himself. He is equated to God as his Son. So what do we see in this passage so far? Well, we see that Jesus shines with God's glory. He's greater than Moses and Elijah. He's the Messiah that Israel and the world has been waiting for, and he is the Son of God in perfect relationship to the Father, and all must obey him. All of this happened in something like the blink of an eye for the disciples. They would have understood exactly what we had to kind of dig through to get. Jesus, for them, just created the greatest mountaintop experience of all time. He didn't plan any events or activities. He didn't have any worship band or anything. He just revealed himself. So now let's take a look at what this does to the disciples, how the disciples respond to this. We'll look at the response of the disciples. That's your next fill in the blank. The response of the disciples. Let's look back at verse 4. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put 3 shelters up, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Well, that's the greatest understatement of all time. It's good for us to be here. But simply what Peter's telling them is that he and the disciples want the mountaintop to never end. The disciples want the mountaintop to never end. Peter just had the greatest experience of God in his life. He doesn't want it to end, and we can't blame him, can we? Jesus has just shown himself to be himself. Moses and Elijah are there. They've never seen Moses and Elijah, and they're there too. And Peter's just stupefied. He didn't want the mountaintop to never end. We're the same way. We really are. We don't want the mountaintop to end either. And it's a perfectly natural response. I think, judging by the amount of people in this room, and the fact that all of you, except for 2, are older than me, I think you all have had mountaintop experiences in your life that you didn't want to end. You didn't want to come down off of. Moments when it may have just been a sermon that for the first time helped you to see some truth about God, and it just astounded you. Maybe it was a worship service and you just couldn't stop singing. Maybe it was just a time in your life where God really spoke to you and changed your heart about something. And you didn't want it to end. You didn't want to come off that high. Maybe it was a time when you accepted the Lord for the first time in your life, and you knew the gospel, and you knew that you were saved and that eternal life was coming your way. And you just didn't want it to end. And Peter's doing the exact same thing. But just like us, Peter's mountaintop experience was about to be over. All of us know that mountaintop experience doesn't last. And there's a very specific reason why it doesn't last. And the second response we see here of the disciples reveals the answer. So let's look at verse 5. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. Terrified. See, the disciples are overwhelmed with fear. The disciples are overwhelmed with fear. And the comparison that's being made now is the disciples to Israel. See, the disciples still have the same response to God's presence that the Israelites did with Moses at Mount Sinai a few thousand years before. Terror. Terror. After God spoke the 10 Commandments to his people from the mountaintop in Exodus 20, it says this: "All the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, 'Speak to us yourself and we'll listen, but do not have God speak to us or we'll die.' Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." And the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. See, God's law was given through Moses, but it didn't bring people closer to God. God's people at Mount Sinai and the disciples at Mount Hermon stood at a distance from God in terror. There's still something that must be done, and Jesus knows this too. The mountaintop didn't last because something still had to be done. Mankind is still living in fear of God. Mankind cannot have a mountaintop experience with God fully because they can't handle it. We sang earlier a song all of us love, including myself. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. You sure you want to do that? The things of earth will grow faintly dim in the light of his glory and grace. Now, if all we had in that hymn was the light of his glory and look full into his face, where would we be? We would be doing what the Israelites did. We would be doing what the disciples did. We'd be terrified. We can't handle it. That's the reality of the people of God until something is done about it. See, the reality that we have to think about for ourselves as well is when we want the mountaintop with God, when we don't want it to end, when we want God's presence to be here now, fully, forever, what we don't realize when we're saying that is that condemns everyone and anyone who does not trust in Jesus Christ as their Savior. For the mountaintop to happen fully and forever now, here, means that everyone who cannot handle God's presence, who has not been saved, is gone. That's why the mountaintop couldn't continue. But Jesus didn't stop with his glory. It's not the only thing that he revealed here. In fact, he revealed his glory in another way that we desperately need. And so we'll continue reading in verse 6. It says this. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Well, why then do the teachers of the law say Elijah must first come?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah has already come. They did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." What we see here is the humility of Jesus. The humility of Jesus. We see two things about it. The first is that Jesus veiled his glory to take away their fear. He veiled his glory to take away their fear. Jesus, just like Moses, takes a veil over his face, dims his glory back into his human self without his glory being manifested, and he reaches out to touch the disciples. But he does this for a purpose. He knows they're afraid of God, and they have every right to be afraid of God, because their sin has not been dealt with. And so Jesus, in this illustrative act, does exactly what he came to do by reaching out his hand and touching them and saying, "Don't be afraid." He came as God in flesh with all of his glory dimmed, that you could not see God's glory, with all of his majesty kept back from wiping us out. And he came down a mountain to do something that we needed him to do, and that was, he came down the mountain because he knew mankind needed Calvary's hill. Jesus came down the mountaintop because he knew mankind needed Calvary's hill. In verse 9, at the end of verse 9, he says, in the same way the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. When Jesus says this, I don't think he's saying it in a sense of depression or fear or desperation. I think he's making a choice. He's making a choice to come down off the mountaintop, just as he came down out of heaven, and to go into Jerusalem to allow those people, to allow us, to put him on a cross on a hill. Because he knew that's what we needed. He knew that's what we needed. He knew that the disciples and this world was not ready for God to come. And so he did something about that. And unlike Moses, the disciples, they don't come down the mountain with the Ten Commandments, continuing simply to tell people what's wrong with themselves. They come down the mountain with God himself. God who is ready to cure them of all that the Ten Commandments condemn them of all the fear that stands in between themselves and a relationship with God. So Jesus sacrifices his own glory to die for their sin. And Jesus, I think, is telling us something by that. Jesus is telling us to sacrifice the mountaintop now for Calvary's hill. Sacrifice the mountaintop for Calvary's hill. I think God doesn't allow our mountaintops to last. First of all, because we're not fully glorified. We're not fully there yet. We couldn't really handle it if he did. It'd be like standing 5 feet from the sun. But I think also, God doesn't allow our mountaintops to last because the only mountaintop he really wants to take us to is heaven. And until then, he's shown us what he wants us to do. To walk down the mountaintop and to lead others to Calvary's hill. To show others what Jesus came to do. To reveal to others that they are lost in sin. That they need God so desperately, and that he knew that and suffered so much so that they could be drawn back to God. So I don't want to tell you this evening that you should never seek a mountaintop experience with God. I don't want to tell you that going away to Hume Lake or anywhere else like that is a bad thing to do. But I do want to tell myself, and I do want to tell all of us, that in this life, we're not promised mountaintops for a reason. And the reason is that we're here to lead others to heaven's mountaintop. And to hope and to long for the day when that comes. But until then, to do some hard work for the gospel. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, by your grace, by your incredible grace, you reveal yourself to us in so many ways. You give us mountaintops in so many ways in this life, you really do. Some that we don't even see. But Lord, this life is not about having mountaintop experiences. You told the disciples that, and I think you're telling us that. This life is all about Calvary's hilltop. So Lord, would you speak to our hearts to have the same kind of love, the same kind of devotion, the same kind of heart that you have for this lost world, a world that's not even really looking for mountaintop experiences. And Lord, would you help us to bring them to the foot of your cross, to humbly kneel before you, repent of their sins, and to accept the free gift that you have given at great cost to yourself, so that we could ultimately one day be rid of all the things that weigh us down and be in a mountaintop experience that will last for eternity, but to be there with so many other people that you've allowed us to lead to a hill in this lifetime. Bless us, Lord, we pray, in Jesus' name, our only Savior. Amen.